They thought the journey was over. After days crammed inside a cattle car, choking on air so thick it tasted of iron and fear, the prisoners believed the nightmare would end when the train stopped. Instead, it had only just begun. The doors slammed open and a cold wind swept in, cutting through the stench and the darkness. Voices shouted in German, dogs barked, and floodlights burned into the night like a cruel sunrise. It was May of 1944, and they had arrived at Auschwitz-Birkenau. The ramp stretched before them, lined with guards in black uniforms. Behind the wire fences, smokestacks rose against the sky, spilling ash that drifted like grey snow. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men tried to look calm for their families, but inside, their hearts beat fast with a dread they could not name. No one was told where they were or what would happen next. They were ordered into 2 lines, one for men, one for women and children. Then came the doctors. SS officers with crisp white gloves and clean coats walked slowly along the rows of exhausted prisoners. They did not shout or strike. They barely spoke. Instead, they studied each person with a quick, practiced glance. One wave of the hand meant life, another meant death. That small motion decided everything. Some tried to stand taller, to look strong. Others hid their weakness behind calm faces. But there was no pattern, no way to predict. An old man might be sent right to the barracks, while a teenager, limping from days in the train, would be sent left toward the gas chambers. Joseph Mengele, the camp's most infamous doctor, was often there on the ramp. Prisoners later remembered him smiling as he directed the lines. His decisions were swift, sometimes lasting only seconds. To the Nazis, this was science mixed with bureaucracy, a system for dividing labour from waste. To the prisoners, it was a judgment beyond comprehension. They didn't yet know that those sent left would die within the hour. The ones sent right believed they had survived, but in truth they had only been chosen to die later. The cold efficiency of it numbed the mind. The ramp looked like order, but it was order built for killing. When families were separated, screams rose through the air. Mothers begged to stay with their children. Some guards dragged them apart by force. Others ignored the cries completely. Those few minutes on the ramp became the dividing line between memory and silence. Trains arrived day and night, each carrying hundreds of lives reduced to a single decision. The doctors moved with mechanical precision, their boots crunching over gravel, their gestures steady, detached. Behind them, the smoke from the crematoria never stopped. For many, the last thing they saw was that hand in the air, pointing left or right. The difference between living 10 minutes longer or not at all was nothing more than the tilt of a wrist. When people imagine Auschwitz, they often think of ink, the blue-black numbers stamped forever into the skin of prisoners. But the truth is that ink was not what decided who lived or died on the ramp. That was done by a simple motion, a gesture so small it could pass unnoticed. The ink came later, and it served a colder purpose. After the selection, those chosen for labour were herded through the gates, bearing the words, Arbeit macht frei, work makes you free. It was not freedom waiting for them beyond the arch, but registration. Every prisoner who survived the ramp had to be recorded, catalogued, and stripped of identity. They no longer had names, they became numbers. At Auschwitz, this process was different from other camps. Here, the number was not only written on paper, but carved into the body itself. In the early years, metal stamps pressed ink under the skin with painful strikes. Later, the SS used a crude tattooing pen with a needle and ink. The mark appeared on the left forearm, 5 digits, that burned at first, then healed into a scar. Prisoners often described the feeling as both shame and disbelief. They were still alive, but no longer themselves. It was not done on the ramp. The ramp was where the pointing hand decided life or death. For those who passed that first test, the ink came as a second blow. It was the moment the system claimed them completely. The tattoo was meant for control, not for mercy. The Germans believed numbers were more efficient than names, easier to manage on forms, lists, and death records. Every piece of food, clothing, or medicine could be tracked against that number. It was order in a place built for destruction. Some prisoners noticed temporary marks before tattooing. During selections or medical exams, guards used chalk or grease pencils to make quick symbols on arms, backs, or coats. Sometimes it meant transfer to another barrack. Sometimes it marked the sick for later inspection. The white or red smears washed away with water, but they carried the same weight as ink. They told who would be seen again and who would not. To the outside world, ink seemed permanent, but inside Auschwitz, permanence had no meaning. Numbers could fade, skin could burn, and lives could vanish overnight. What stayed was the idea that everything could be labelled, measured, reduced. That was the real horror of the ink. Survivors would later speak of looking down at their arms years after liberation, the numbers still there, ghosts of a system that tried to erase their humanity. Some covered them, others kept them visible as proof. The ink that began as a tool of control became, after the war, a mark of endurance. But on the ramp, there was no ink, no needle, only the silent point of a doctor's hand deciding who would live long enough to receive a number at all. Auschwitz-Birkenau was not just a camp, it was a machine built to kill and to work. Two purposes existed side by side, feeding each other like gears in motion. One side was death, the other was labour, and every train that arrived became fuel for both. From the moment the doors of the cattle cars opened, every person was a resource to be used or discarded. Those who looked weak, too young, too old, or too sick were sent straight to the gas chambers. Those who looked strong enough were marked for work, though few of them understood what that meant. The system had been designed with precision. Birkenau, also called Auschwitz II, was the killing centre. Its gas chambers and crematoria could process thousands of people in a single day. A short distance away stood the factories, most famously the IG Farben chemical plant at Buenos, where prisoners were forced to labour building synthetic rubber and fuel for the German army. The camps were linked, their purposes intertwined. Slave labour fed the war effort, while the extermination system removed anyone who could no longer serve it. In the eyes of the SS, it was efficiency perfected. Prisoners who survived the selection were marched to barracks, disinfected, shaved, and tattooed. The smell of smoke hung over everything, a constant reminder of what happened to those sent the other way. At night, new arrivals could see the orange glow on the horizon where the chimneys burned. Some still hoped it was a factory, not realizing the truth until it was too late. The rhythm of the camp was cruelly predictable. Each day began with roll call, often lasting hours in freezing wind. Then came work assignments, long marches to the industrial zones, back-breaking shifts under the watch of guards. Those who collapsed were beaten, sometimes shot, or sent back to Birkenau to be reselected. That word meant death. The gas chambers at Birkenau looked like shower rooms, complete with fake nozzles. Prisoners were told they would be disinfected. Zyklon B pellets dropped from openings in the ceiling, releasing gas that filled the room within minutes. The entire process was timed, controlled, recorded. Bodies were burned in nearby crematoria, and the ashes scattered in rivers and fields. Every step was organized as if it were part of an ordinary industry, but this was an industry of death. The same trains that carried prisoners also carried their belongings, sorted and stored in warehouses nicknamed Canada because they overflowed with valuables. Even hair was collected and shipped to factories for use in textiles. Nothing was wasted. The Nazi system turned life into material. In that world, survival was not a sign of mercy but of usefulness. Those chosen for labor lived on borrowed time, feeding the same system that consumed them. Auschwitz was more than a camp. It was the moment when bureaucracy learned how to kill. Every arrival at Auschwitz passed beneath the eyes of the doctors. They were not healers in the camp. They were judges. Wearing crisp uniforms and polished boots, they stood at the center of the selection ramp as trains came in, clipboard in hand, faces unreadable. Their duty was to separate the living from the soon-to-be dead. It was done without emotion, as if they were inspecting machines instead of human beings. The most infamous of them was Dr. Joseph Mengele, a man who would come to be known as the Angel of Death. To the prisoners, he seemed calm, even charming, his gloves always spotless, his smile polite. But with a flick of his wrist, he could send hundreds to the gas chambers. His power was absolute. Alongside Mengele were other SS doctors, men like Eduard Wirths, Fritz Klein, and Horst Fischer. They rotated shifts on the ramp, taking turns performing selections, writing reports, and conducting experiments inside the barracks. Their medical degrees had not been stripped away by the war. Instead, the war had given them permission to use their knowledge for destruction. Each selection followed the same grim rhythm. A doctor would stand near the arriving train while prisoners stumbled out, blinded by light and noise. Interpreters barked orders for men to stand on one side, women and children on the other. The doctor's eyes moved quickly, searching for signs of weakness or strength. A small gesture to the right meant temporary survival. To the left meant death. He did not need to explain. Guards and orderlies moved the lines as instructed. For the SS, this was considered routine. For the victims, it was the end of everything. Mengele's interest, however, went beyond the ramp. He searched the arriving lines for twins, for people with unusual features, for anyone who might serve his scientific obsessions. When he spotted a pair of identical children, he would step forward himself, voice gentle, asking their mother in German or through a translator, "Are they twins?" If she said yes, they were taken away, often smiling because the doctor's tone sounded kind. They never saw their parents again. Mengele claimed his research was for genetic science, to understand heredity and improve the Aryan race. In reality, it was cruelty disguised as research. Children were injected with chemicals, measured, dissected, or killed to compare organs. Their bodies became tools for an ideology that believed some lives were more valuable than others. The doctors kept meticulous records, charts filled with neat handwriting, as if the order of ink could hide the chaos of their crimes. Not all of them enjoyed their work, but few ever refused. The system made obedience easier than conscience. Within the walls of Auschwitz, medicine had been reversed. The doctor's gaze no longer healed, it condemned. Every wave of the hand, every note on a clipboard, became part of a routine that turned life and death into paperwork. The system at Auschwitz was built on order, and even that order had its symbols. After the selections on the ramp, the prisoners chosen to live were moved forward into the camp, stripped, washed, and processed. Everything was counted, written, and marked. Testimonies from survivors describe how guards and SS clerks used chalk and grease pencils to mark prisoners, boards to tally their numbers, and gestures to guide them through the labyrinth of the camp. It was not chaos. It was a grim routine repeated day after day. Once inside the processing area, prisoners were separated again. Men were sent in one direction, women in another. The noise was constant. Orders shouted in German, boots stomping, water running. Some prisoners were given quick inspections by camp doctors or orderlies to decide whether they would be sent to labour blocks or to the infirmary. Those deemed too sick were often marked with a simple cross or line on their clothing or skin, a smear of chalk on the back, a mark on the sleeve, a stripe across the chest. It looked harmless, but it carried meaning. The mark told guards where to send them next, and for some, it meant a quiet trip to Block 25, the waiting area before the gas chambers. Others were marked for re-inspection, to be examined again after a few days of work. Nothing was explained. The prisoners learned the meanings only by watching what happened to others. Wooden boards with names or numbers hung outside registration rooms. Clerks scratched tallies into notebooks, counting how many had arrived, how many were dead, how many were still fit to work. The system was designed to track lives as if they were inventory. Chalk was faster than ink, and mistakes could be wiped away with a sleeve. Guards sometimes used grease pencils that left darker stains, especially in cold weather when chalk would not stick to wet uniforms or bare skin. Prisoners recalled standing in long lines, the air filled with the smell of soap, disinfectant, and fear. Some clutched the hands of their relatives until the moment came when they were marked and separated. Those few strokes of chalk divided families as easily as the doctor's hand had done on the ramp. The procedures varied with time. In the early years, when transports were smaller, the markings were less formal, sometimes just a nod from a guard. By late 1943, when deportations increased, the process became more organized. Boards listed block assignments, and prisoners were moved like pieces in a system that never stopped shifting. Even the smallest gesture carried weight. A guard's glance, a raised finger, a motion toward the left or right could change everything to the SS. These marks were tools of control. To the prisoners, they were signs of fate, simple strokes of chalk deciding who would live to see another sunrise and who would vanish before night. Those sent to the left on the ramp did not know they had been sentenced to die. The guards shouted for them to move in groups, guiding them down narrow paths lined with barbed wire. The air smelled of smoke, though few could tell from where. They were told they were going to bathe and to be disinfected after the long train ride. The lie was delivered so calmly that many believed it, clinging to the idea that order meant safety. Mothers carried their children, old men leaned on sticks, and young women helped the weak to walk faster. The line moved toward a row of low brick buildings with chimneys. These were the crematoria of Birkenau, where gas chambers and ovens operated side by side. Inside, the deception continued. Prisoners were told to undress, to tie their shoes together so they could find them later, to remember where they had placed their clothes. Signs written in German read bathhouse and disinfection. Even small hooks along the walls were numbered to make the illusion complete. Eyewitnesses and later forensic studies confirmed how carefully the process was planned. The chambers were sealed concrete rooms with false shower heads in the ceiling. Once the doors were shut, SS men poured Zyklon B pellets through openings above. The pellets released hydrogen cyanide gas, a poison that filled the room in minutes. Screams began almost immediately. Some survivors who worked in the Sonderkommando, the groups forced to handle the bodies, described the sound fading after 10 or 15 minutes, replaced by silence. When the gas cleared, the doors were opened and the bodies were dragged out and piled in the corridors. Watches, rings, and gold teeth were removed. Hair was cut and bagged for use in factories. Everything, even the dead, was treated as material. The crematoria ovens burned day and night, Ashes were shoveled into pits or dumped into nearby rivers. The entire process from arrival to death could take less than 2 hours. Historical investigations after the war confirmed the design and capacity of these buildings. Plans and documents recovered from the SS construction office matched the testimonies of those who survived. The precision of it was horrifying. The chambers could hold hundreds at a time, the ovens working in shifts to keep up with the transports that kept coming. Smoke hung over Birkenau like a permanent cloud. Those chosen for labour often smelled it before they understood what it meant. Some asked about the fires and were told it was a factory burning rubbish. But others began to see the truth when they noticed the piles of children's clothing near the crematoria doors. There were no children in the labour camps. The left column never returned. For those who followed that path, the end came quietly, inside rooms that looked like showers, under the watch of men who called it cleansing. The lie lasted until the very last breath, and by then it no longer mattered. For those sent to the right on the ramp, survival seemed possible. They had passed the first test, spared from the line that vanished behind the gas chamber doors. But what waited for them was not rescue. It was a slower kind of death, one built from hunger, exhaustion, and cruelty. After selection, prisoners were marched away from the ramp toward the main camp. Guards shouted for them to keep pace. The cold bit through their thin clothes, and many had no shoes left after the transport. They entered large barracks, where the process of registration began. Names were taken, but only to be replaced by numbers. Their heads were shaved, their bodies disinfected, and their clothes burned. They were handed striped uniforms, each one marked with a coloured triangle showing what group they belonged to. Then came the tattoo, the final act of erasing their identity. The needle bit into their skin, pressing blue ink into the flesh of the left forearm. The number was now who they were. That number would be called at roll call, marked on food rations and written on death lists. Prisoners were divided into blocks, long wooden buildings with rows of bunks stacked 3 high. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, smoke, and sickness. Straw mattresses were infested with lice, and there was little water to drink. Disease spread fast. Dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis claimed lives faster than bullets. At dawn, a siren blared across the camp. Roll call began in the freezing dark and could last for hours. The week collapsed where they stood and were dragged away. Work details followed. Some prisoners were sent to factories like IG Farben's Monowitz, where they mixed chemicals for synthetic rubber and fuel. Others dug ditches, carried bricks, or unloaded trains. They laboured from sunrise to nightfall with almost no food. A meal meant a bowl of watery soup and a crust of bread, sometimes less. Anyone who slowed down risked being beaten or shot. The guards called it work education, but there was no lesson to learn except endurance. For every worker who died, a new one arrived from the next transport. The system was designed that way. Labour was a resource to be used up and replaced. Even those who survived the days of labour lived under constant fear. Selections were held inside the camp too. If someone looked too thin or too weak, a doctor or officer could order them removed. The trucks would come at night, driving toward the crematoria. Prisoners whispered that it was better to keep moving, to stay invisible. They learned to hide illness, to trade bread for medicine, to steal rags for warmth. To live in Auschwitz was to fight every hour against disappearing. The right side of the ramp had promised life, but inside the camp, that life was only borrowed time, measured in hunger and cold. Inside Auschwitz, death did not always come from the gas chambers. For some, it came in a laboratory dressed as science. Among the thousands who passed through the selections, a few were pulled aside, not for work or for execution, but for something called research. To the doctors who ran these programs, human life was a material for study. Prisoners were selected for experiments that would have sounded like medical work, but were nothing more than torture disguised in white coats. Joseph Mengele led the most infamous of these efforts. He searched the arriving trains for twins, for dwarfs, and for anyone with unusual physical features. When he found them, he spoke kindly, his tone gentle and reassuring. Children often smiled when he took their hands, not realizing that he was separating them from their families forever. They were taken to special barracks known as the Twin Block. Inside, their lives were measured and recorded. Mengele and his assistants drew blood, injected dyes into eyes to see if color could be changed, and operated without anesthesia. When one twin died, the other was killed so that their organs could be compared. Hundreds of children passed through those rooms, and almost none survived. Beyond Mengele's work, other SS doctors carried out experiments under the name of research for the Reich. Karl Clauberg tested methods of sterilization on women prisoners, injecting chemicals into their wombs to find faster ways to prevent childbirth. Horst Schumann exposed both men and women to radiation, burning their flesh in an effort to destroy reproductive organs. The victims screamed, but the doctors wrote notes calmly, as if they were studying a laboratory rat. Every experiment had a file, a chart, and a report. The precision of it all made it worse. These so-called medical projects were not random acts of cruelty. They were planned, funded, and reviewed by higher officers in Berlin. Some prisoners were chosen from the ramp and told they would be taken to a hospital. It sounded like mercy, but it was another form of death. In the barracks, they were given numbers, examined, and tested until their bodies broke. When they died, their corpses were dissected for study or burned in the crematoria. The experiments were meant to serve a purpose, to find ways to make German soldiers more resistant to pain, or to find new ways to eliminate populations efficiently. None of it produced real medical knowledge. It produced only suffering. Survivors who lived through the experiments spoke later about the silence of the doctors, how they rarely looked their subjects in the eye. The victims were not called by name, only by number. In Auschwitz, science had been turned upside down. The tools meant to heal became weapons. The white coat replaced the gun, but the result was the same. In the end, those taken for experiments did not live longer than others. They only died slower, inside rooms that pretended to be clinics. In Auschwitz, the destruction of identity was not loud or sudden. It was organized, written down, and sealed with ink. After the ramp, those who were chosen for labor were processed into the system, and that system demanded order. The Nazis believed that everything could be managed through numbers, and that included human beings. Auschwitz was the only camp in the entire network where tattoos became mandatory. It began in the autumn of 1941, when Soviet prisoners of war arrived in such large numbers that their deaths came faster than paperwork could keep up. Guards lost track of who was who, so they decided to mark the bodies directly. At first, metal stamps with needles punched holes into the skin, and ink was rubbed into the wounds. Later, a crude tattooing pen with a single needle was used to prick the numbers along the forearm. The mark became permanent, a 5 or 6-digit code that replaced a name. For the SS, this was efficiency. For the prisoner, it was the moment they stopped being seen as human. The tattoo system grew with the camp. By 1943, every new prisoner was tattooed during registration. The ink was dark blue, and the pain was sharp but quick. The numbers followed a sequence by category: men, women, Roma families, children, and special groups, all received separate series. Each new transport added to the count. When a person died, their number was crossed out on paper but remained on their skin until the body was burned. The system worked like an assembly line of control. Prisoners were called by number at roll call, written by number in medical records, and recorded by number on death certificates. The staff often ignored names completely. To them, the number was easier to pronounce, easier to erase. In testimonies, survivors spoke about the first time they looked down and saw the ink. Some described it as the worst moment of all. The tattoo was not just a mark, it was proof that the camp owned them. Even years after liberation, many could not bring themselves to explain its meaning. Others kept it visible as a way to prove what had been done. The tattoos, once symbols of dehumanization, became signs of survival. The irony was that the same number meant life in the beginning, because only those who lived long enough to be registered received one. The people sent straight from the ramp to the gas chambers were never tattooed at all. The Nazis recorded their deaths with no mark, no trace, as if they had never existed. The ink became a strange border between memory and erasure. It served a system that saw people as entries on a list, but after the war, those small numbers became evidence, silent witnesses carved into flesh. In a place where individuality had been outlawed, the tattoos that once stripped people of identity became the proof that they had lived. The story that Auschwitz doctors used ink to mark who would live 10 minutes longer sounds like something that could be true, because the cruelty of the camp almost defies imagination. But in truth, there was no ink on the ramp, no pens, no needles, no writing on skin. What decided life or death was far simpler and far colder. It was a gesture, a wave of the hand. The doctors stood before the endless lines of prisoners stepping down from the trains, scanning faces in the pale light. To the right meant labor, to the left meant death. No one explained the meaning. No words were needed. The gesture carried more power than any weapon. Some prisoners thought the mark of chalk or grease meant something else, that the scribble on a coat or the tap of a stick might protect them. But chalk washed away. The true decision was invisible. It happened in seconds and could not be changed. The myth of the ink comes from what happened next. Those who were sent to live, even for a little while, were tattooed after registration. That ink came days or hours after the ramp, pressed into the skin by an SS clerk or camp medic. It was the stamp of belonging to the system. The number made them traceable, not safe. The ink did not save lives. It recorded them, at least for a time. It was the record of a bureaucracy that had learned to manage murder as if it were paperwork. 10 minutes longer was not mercy, it was a delay. The people sent to labor were not spared because of kindness or error, but because the camp needed them to keep running. The machine of Auschwitz was built on both killing and using. Every hand that could carry bricks or turn a wrench was worth a few more hours of breath. When their strength failed, the next selection came, and the wave of the hand returned to finish what it had started. Survivors later said that the hardest thing to remember was how ordinary the moment looked. The doctor's gloves were clean, the clipboard neat. The smoke from the crematoria rose like fog in the distance. There were no loud speeches, no chaos, only quiet decisions that erased entire families. That quietness is what makes the story of ink both powerful and misleading. Ink feels human, deliberate, personal, but the real horror was the opposite. Death at Auschwitz was impersonal, efficient, and fast. It depended not on markings, but on the smallest movement of a wrist. The people who lived a little longer carried that memory into the world after the war. Some carried the numbers on their arms, the proof of what had been done. Others carried the silence. The truth of Auschwitz does not need myth to make it terrible. The reality is enough. A simple gesture decided who would live 10 minutes longer, and that truth, recorded forever in ink, is the story the world must never forget.